we have started the broadcast. So while we wait for everybody to join, because it may take some time for all the attendees to come on, although we have already reached about 50 people. Let me first ask you, Pranjal, how has this lockdown been treating you?
So to begin with, it was quite good. We were all pretty productive. I was managing a few workouts, managing to do some writing work. But then I guess self-motivation only lasts so long. So now it's just been a very, very lazy. I've actually managed to put on a white shirt after a month and a half. I think the last I went to court was on the 15th of March or thereabouts. So I think we're all in the same boat that way.
And what about you, Mr. Hegde? How has the lockdown been treating you?
It's been treating me well. I can't complain. I think the correct analogy is something which you people may not remember. In the old days, when I was young, we used to go on school holidays to a place called Muluk. Muluk was your not only your hometown, but your actual the village from which your ancestors came.
Right.
And those trips were, you went there and time stood still and things went on boringly, agonizingly slow. That's exactly what I feel like. That way, after nearly 50 years of life, I've come again to one of those never-ending Muluk holidays.
So this is our small attempt to keep everybody entertained and educated during these times. Let me wish everybody who's joined us a very good evening. My name is Abhay Anturkar. I am the convener of Debrief. Firstly, let me thank all of you for joining us for this webinar. Today we have with us Mr. Sanjay Hegde, who's a senior advocate practicing in the Supreme Court of India. Mr. Hegde is not only a well-known lawyer, having appeared in many high-profile cases of both legal and social importance, but he's also known for his appearances in the press and is fairly popular as a vocal supporter of liberal values, which in my personal opinion is very important these days. He wears his heart on his sleeve and does not hold back his punches. So I would like to declare that Debrief will claim no responsibility for his views. They are completely his own. Please don't sue us for any statement that he or Pranjal may make. We have very limited resources and we can't afford good lawyers. Mr. Hegde will be interviewed by Pranjal Kishore. Pranjal is an advocate practicing in New Delhi. Many of us in the Supreme Court know him as Mr. Hegde's protege. We look forward to an interesting chat between the Guru and his Chela. Before I hand it over to you, Pranjal, just a quick request to all our attendees. Any questions that they may have for Mr. Hegde may be typed in the Q&A tab, and we will try to take as many questions as possible, subject of course. With this, Pranjal, I'm handing over the reins to you. It's all over to you.
Thank you, Abhay. So I think to begin with, it's very strange to see a person who you see every day and then to see them after a month and see them across on a computer screen. So you told us about the Muluk concept, but how have you been keeping yourself busy? You're someone who's used to running around a dozen courts a day. So how has the last month been for you? What are you doing? Is there something you are reading?
Pranjal, you're right that I used to run through various courts. This is one time when I have decided to just vegetate. And to be very honest, I have not stepped out from my house. You know that I live on the second floor. I have not climbed down those stairs since the 21st of March. In the initial days, of course, I didn't know what the virus was all about, but I knew that given my health conditions, given the health conditions of others in my family, including my aged mother, it was best to keep out of trouble. So if you know what I mean, I was doing exactly what we sometimes do in court. There is something pesky which is happening in the matter, but as long as you sit tight and stay home and stay safe, it is likely that the matter will end in your favor. Therefore, keep quiet, let things blow over.
I think that's very good advice for all of us who are staying at home. So something about your own journey. You started out in Manipal and Udupi, and then you shifted to Bombay, where you finished the rest of your schooling and your college. Now, before we go to that, could you tell us something about how life in Bombay was back in the 70s and 80s, especially for someone who was a non-Marathi speaker?
See, I was in Bombay from around 1971 onwards when I was in the second standard. One of my earliest memories is of India being at war with Pakistan and blackouts and the actual planes flying over the terraces, and I used to watch from the balcony. So Bombay those days was a different Bombay. It was a cosmopolitan English-speaking Bombay in certain parts. There was also the incipient rise of the Shiv Sena. The Shiv Sena was not particularly kind towards South Indians in those days. So one of my other early memories is of my mother telling me once on the streets of Bombay, no, don't speak in Kannada, because there were all those fears at that point of time that, you know, if you were a South Indian, you would likely be assaulted on the streets and things like that. So there is this theory in psychology that you grow up to confront the very things that you were scared of as a child. And so I really think at times that my standing up for the lost, the scared, comes from that little child on the Bombay street who was told that he could not speak his mother tongue.
So moving on from that, you graduated in commerce, and I understand that you were working for a computer company. You were preparing for the civil services at the same time. So what made you take up a third subject at that time? Why did you take up the subject of law?
Well, law was, my father was a lawyer in Bombay. His uncle was a lawyer, and I believe that there have been other ancestors, though not in the direct line, who were also lawyers. So law was something which there was a tradition of, at least on the father side of the family. And you must remember that I come from a matriarchal community. So we don't really count the father side of the family. On the mother side of the family, there were no lawyers. But nevertheless, law was something that had grown up around. I didn't think while growing up that I would be a lawyer. I actually thought I wanted to be a journalist, but I was told when we went for vocational guidance in school that, look, journalists don't earn that much. Maybe it's better that you look around. Why don't you go into commerce? I had an admission into St. Xavier's College in Bombay in arts. I had a Podar in commerce, but then life took a turn and I went off to Udupi, to the very college from which my parents had graduated, MGM College, Udupi, and there I took up commerce. Post-commerce, post-Udupi, and those 5 good years of Udupi where I got in touch with my roots. I came back to Bombay. I decided that I would start earning a living. I started working. Side by side, I also got enrolled in law college. Thought I'd get an extra degree on the side. And there was one more reason to get into law college at that point of time. You see, as you know, Pranjal, I used to do a lot of college quizzing. And I'd started college quizzing from Udupi, which really had no tradition of quizzing. And I wanted to continue quizzing. So I required some college identity to go on to quizzes. And that was one more reason to go into law college. That gave me 3 years.
So I think I'll come back on the quizzing bit a little later. Now, could you just tell us about how law college was for you? Were you the sorts who went through the DD Basus, or were you more the Jhabwala types?
Well, Jabwala was high literature for me. There's a third category that is called 3 test papers. I won't sell myself that short. I did go through, at least in the first year, I went through Samand on jurisprudence and all that. But then my marks did not reflect it. And after the first year, life had got busy when I was working with IDM. It was a college for me, evening college, KC Law, a college of law was where I would come from work, sit down on the steps, have a sandwich from Ramesh Sandwichwala, and then if there was nothing else to do, I would go into class.
So I believe that this is more related to your LLM days, but I think one of the current judges of the Supreme Court was a professor of yours back then. Could you tell us something about that?
Justice Chandrachud had then shifted from Delhi to Bombay. He had shifted from the Supreme Court and had come into practice in the Bombay High Court. And Bombay has a tradition of good lawyers also teaching in law college. And that's because 2 or 3 law colleges, that's Government Law, KC and Siddharth, are very close to the courts. So it's perfectly possible for somebody to teach an hour or 2 in the mornings and then attend court thereafter, or an hour or 2 in the evening. So it was not only Justice Chandrachud, I also had Tolly Cooper as one of my teachers in KC Law. Justice Chandrachud actually taught me constitutional law while I was doing my LLM. That LLM was in Bombay University, which was again next to the Bombay High Court. I found him to be an extremely meticulous teacher, the same way that he communicates with us in court. Some part of the technique, I think, comes from his days teaching. And I didn't know that life would throw us together there again. We've been in contact thereafter. When I became a lawyer, he used to he used to brief my senior in 1 or 2 matters. So we've been in touch on and off from those days.
So, now, you joined Mullah and Mullah after you finished your graduation in law. This was in 1989. And you spent 3 years there. So could you tell us about the formative years and how they've helped you with your practice as you've gone forward?
I actually joined Mullah shortly before I became a lawyer. And my Mullah years were also years when I was doing my LLM and I was writing the civil services. So Mullah basically showed me what a large old world law firm was like. I came to the conclusion that it was 20 partners, each of them running a mini enterprise of his own, and Mullah was more a kind of flag of confederacy, which was a easy brand for which people came in, but then they found the individual partner who best suited them, and they stuck onto that. Most of my work in those days was on the desk. Getting into the courtroom was not really encouraged in a solicitor's firm. I occasionally did small matters, order to rule 2, or leave under clause 12 of the letters patent, things like that. But I don't think Mullah made me a courtroom lawyer so much, but it did tell me as to how to organize a brief, how to be firm in communication, and how to generally handle a matter vis-a-vis the client.
So you moved to Delhi in September 1991. Now, was it the civil services which brought you to Delhi? Could you just tell us about the first few months or years that you spent in Delhi?
Well, I told you I was writing the civil services when I was in Mullahs, and then I qualified. Because of a bad interview, I ended up not in the IAS but in one of the allied services. So I had a government job in hand. At the same point of time, my time in Mullah and Mullah was coming to an end. I did not want to go on to become a solicitor and then wait internally to be hoping to become a partner in some solicitor's firm or the other. I knew that my future lay as a counsel in the bar. I was hoping that the Mr. B.S. Besania, with whom I was working, would put me through to a good counsel on the Bombay original side. He used to handle the Bombay Port Trust, and therefore he often used to come to Delhi for matters and for opinions from law officers. He was coming to the Attorney General, Mr. G. Ramaswamy, for an opinion. And casually in conversation, he told me that he doesn't have juniors currently. Some of his juniors have left him. So I told him, why don't you ask whether I can join him? I didn't think that the Attorney General of India would be interested in an obscure lawyer from Bombay. To Mr. Besania's credit, he did ask Mr. Ramaswamy, and to Mr. Ramaswamy's credit, and I thank him even today, the late Mr. Ramaswamy, he said, okay, let me come and meet me next time in Bombay. I went and met him, and then we discussed my moving to Delhi and a time frame and all that. Later, when I came and actually joined him in Delhi in September, I realized that two other people had joined him in the meanwhile. One of them is Mohit Mathur, who is now the Delhi High Court bar president, and another was Sudhir Walia. So I found myself to be a bit of an extra wheel. I had my job through the UPSC. My parents wanted me to opt for a more secure career. They thought that the law, my father having been a lawyer, my mother being a lawyer's wife, she thought that the uncertainty in the profession was not really worth it. They were desperately wanted me to join the job that I had been offered. I kept the job on hold. I had come to Mr. Ramaswamy, and I found myself a bit of a third wheel. So I had to make myself useful. And the first jobs that I actually did for him, which he found useful, was to write the references of people who had passed away. As Attorney General, he had to give a reference speech. Mr. So-and-so passed away, this happened, and all that. And you must remember that this was the pre-Google era. You didn't know anything about anyone. You had to go through old AIRs to figure out who the man was, find out whether there was any writing on him, find out his big cases, and then present something. So that, in writing references and obituary references, was my first real contribution to the law in those days. Yes.
So since you just mentioned the lack of technology back in the day, you've been at the Supreme Court for almost the last 30 years. And we are standing at a time where technology is going to change the way the law is practiced. Now, could you tell us about how technology has changed over the 30 years in the Supreme Court? And how quickly do you think have lawyers been able to adapt to the changes?
Well, one thing I know about lawyers, when forced to do it, they adapt. I know a smattering of Gujarati, but my Gujarati was learnt precisely because I needed to get ahead in Mullah and Mullah and get my drafts typed from old Parsi typists who would otherwise take forever to pick up a document from the typing pool and type it out. So if you spoke to them in Gujarati and say, Auntie, zara kari nakhni sahib no joye, they would actually take out the draft. So from then on, I've seen a lot of changes, a lot of adaptability. When I first came to the Supreme Court, uh, uh, briefs would get cyclo-styled. There were stencils which were cut, and you had to read what was typed to ensure that there was no mistake in the stencil, because otherwise 10 copies of a wrong page would get cyclo-styled. I've seen there was a typist then called Sampath Kumar. He was the same Sampath Kumar of Sampath Kumar versus Union of India. He used to have a lot of work from the advocates on record, who had a lot of work in those days, including Mukul Mudgul, advocate on record as he then was. And I'm told that when Mukul used to make all his payments by check, and Mukul claimed that as expenses. And the amount of typing that this man had done, and payments that had gone by check, the ITO actually went way into Sampath Kumar's residence somewhere in West Vinod Nagar to check whether a Sampath Kumar actually existed. That man was incredible, and he used to be a typist not only to Mukul Mudgal, to me, to Justice Murlidhar, and so many. And he was so good at it that he could almost prepare a first draft of an SLP, and then you added what you wanted to. So I've seen those days. Then you had the early years of WordStar. That is before MS Word came in. A laser printer was a big thing. And now, when we have come to a stage where you are going to have electronic filing, you are going to have arguments through video conferencing, I have no doubt that we lawyers will adapt.
So, now, taking you back again to 91 and the time that you first came to Delhi. Now, we've heard some stories about your apartment in Mayur Vihar, which was something of a sanctuary to people who've actually gone on to start tier 1 law firms, who become senior advocates, and one of them, I believe, is also a judge in the Supreme Court today.
Well, see, one thing about lawyers, wherever there's food and young lawyers, there's always a good conversation, camaraderie, and everything. So I had this bachelor establishment, and where in those days you did not have gas. Cooking gas connection or a telephone connection was a big thing. You needed a minister's letter or so. And so in those days, out of a National Nippo rice cooker, I could conjure up a reasonable meal of rice, dal, and an occasional mutton keema. So it was known that that if you dropped into my house, there would be some kind of food, and people bought along their drink, people bought along anything else they could contribute. That was Adda Central. So, by the way, my roommate then, I must give him credit, is now a judge in the Madras High Court. He put up with a lot, but he contributed his own presence. There have been Mayur Vihar then had become a hub of lawyers, especially after Supreme Enclave and Manu Apartments came up, which were Supreme Court Bar Association and Delhi High Court Bar Association housing societies. So people who lived in Supreme Enclave and well, Justice Kanvilkar, for instance, also occasionally dropped in. But those years were actually my formative years in the bar. One of the frequenters out there was Anand Prasad, who then set up Trilegal, which has gone on to do such fantastic work. There was Upmanyu Hazarika, who's a senior advocate. And there's so many who have done well for themselves. Shivaji Jadhav, continually president of the Advocates on Record Association, was also part of that. So the thing that I take away from those years, those bachelor years, and my early years in the Supreme Court is that make your friends live up to their expectations, do your best, and they are the ones who will stand by you as years go by.
Now, coming back to your senior, Mr. Ramaswamy, now he's someone who we've all heard about. Justice Muralidhar, in his farewell speech, spoke at length about him during his farewell at the Delhi High Court. Is there something that you would like to share about working with Mr. Ramaswamy?
Well, GR had probably the best brain in the business at that point of time. It was extremely sharp. And he was somebody who actually thought both, everybody who worked with him had to know how to handle a lot of matters altogether. It was terrifying then, working with him, where especially if you had to sit in the car with as his car left his house and on the way to the court, he would be mentally running the list through, and he'd say, "The court, what item? Who is there a caveat? Who is the judge?" And you had to have it on your fingertips, and you just basically told him the little point in the case. The thing with him was that, and I've seen it with other greats, but none probably as sharp as he. I've seen it with Mr. Salve, I've seen it with Sibal, that if you just toss one phrase, which was relevant on the point, they knew entirely how the superstructure of the case was to be built. They knew how it came and what its context was, and they could take it from there. So, but GR was just superlative on that. Unfortunately, he was not very disciplined. He was a widower. There was nobody who could tell him that to stop his drinks or his excess in food or anything else. And so he died prematurely. He died in his early 70s. Otherwise, he was a contemporary of the Mr. Narimans, Soli Sorabji, Ashok Desai, Anil Devan, all of GR, Mr. Venugopal, all of them are roughly the same generation.
So you became an advocate on record in the court in 1996. Now, before I actually come on to your practice as an AOR, I believe 96 is also the year when Mr. Vijay Sharma, who's been your clerk for the last 24 years, that's when he joined you. Now, could you tell us something about the importance of a good clerk for an AOR or for a lawyer in general, and about the relationship that a lawyer tends to have with his clerk?
See, I became an AOR with Mr. S.V. Deshpande. His son, Shishir Deshpande, right now is in the Supreme Court. Mr. Deshpande told me how Justice Madan would welcome new AORs. When the chamber summons was filed that I've passed the exam as an AOR, please make me an AOR. Justice Madan would ask each individual person by name. Have you found a good clerk? Are you happy with him? Then go become an AOR. Behind the success of any practice in the Supreme Court, especially as an advocate on record, is the ability of the clerk, the persistence with which he approaches a filing, his contacts in the registry, his ability to convey to the registry how desperate you are for a matter being numbered so that it can be mentioned and can be processed further, and his ability to find the correct brief at the correct point of time. As far as Vijay Sharma is concerned, we've, as you said, we've had 24 years together, and he has been the backbone of my practice, and to an extent that members of my family know that they need not ask me about any papers. They just bypass me and go directly to Sharmaji. So any prospective AORs who are watching this show, I hope you find good wives and I hope you find good clerks or good spouses. Let me put it that way. If ever I was in Justice Madan's position, I'd ask a trick question. And the trick question would be, if your spouse is drowning and your clerk is drowning at the same time, who do you save first? And I'd watch the fun.
So when you become an AOR is also, at least for Supreme Court practice, is time when lawyers tend to move out of the chambers they are working in and start off independently. So what were those years like? You became a standing counsel for the state in 2000, but those 4 years of running a private practice as a newly minted AOR, what was that for you like?
See, I did not move entirely out of Mr. Ramaswamy's chambers because there were some personal reasons involving him. He had a medical setback. He had a stroke in 95, and then he was not exactly on top of his game after that. He lived on till he was 99, till the year 99. And so I continued to attend his office whenever he came to Delhi or whenever he needed. But at the same point of time, I'd launched myself as an AOR. I used to practice out of my house in Supreme Enclave. So there was the study room. That was where I had a small table which was meant for that small study. We fitted all the books in, and there was a longish kind of table outside near the dining area where the clerks sat. That's how I launched my practice as an AOR. Many practices have tight beginnings, but then as time goes by, as the practices grows, you bring up infrastructure in the meanwhile.
So you took over the standing counsel for the state of Karnataka in the year 2000, and you continued in that position for almost 10 years. What was this period like? And just to add to that, you are known to have an independent voice. Now, what was it like working for a government, being standing counsel for a government for 10 years? Did you ever think that your own freedom was curtailed because of the position you held?
See, I was fortunate that the state of Karnataka's brief came to me when I was relatively young. And to be very candid, most people who had a good practice from Karnataka did not want it because the government paid so very little and so very late. In my first Advocate General, Mr. Jairam, described the process of payment as applying procedures which were meant for PWD contractors to lawyers. So every bill went in triplicate with the revenue stamp, and then a file had to be located and created somewhere and all that. So I believe some of my predecessors used to spend entire vacations in Bangalore trying to get their bills passed. I did not do that. I was lucky. I was lucky in as much as my father had given me my flat in Mayur Vihar, and my wife was in a corporate job. So therefore, there was no rent to pay at the end of the month, and there was a check coming in at the end of the month. So within the first few months of taking over as the standing counsel for Karnataka at the end of that financial year, I think I had some 3,000 rupees only left in my bank balance. Some years later, I realized that the situation was the same. Even with regard to becoming an additional Solicitor General. The Vajpayee government had come in, and Mr. R.N. Trivedi became additional Solicitor General. So he was joking that, his astrologer told him that for a few months, there would be tremendous financial stringency. So he asked the astrologer, after that, will things improve? The astrologer said that after that you'll get used to it.
Right.
So that was not exactly what happened with Karnataka. Somewhere some payments came in. Luckily, as one of my friends on those days put it, he said that both me and my wife were relatively frugal, and though my children had been born around that time, things went by. Here I must tell you that I never faced any particular directions from any government officials for most of my career. If anybody tried to suggest anything slightly out of the way, uh, I would just sweetly smile at him and say, "Would you put that in writing, sir? Because then I'm safeguarded." Though, then those instructions would never come in writing. I knew for sure. But nevertheless, all kinds of parties try everything, and especially because the government is there in almost every brief. So you say sometimes in a service matter involving seniority between two sets of government servants, the government has no real role except producing the record and this one, but people still want you to help one side out or the other.
Your quizzing. I have had the chance to partner with you in a quiz. Now, between all the running around for the state of Karnataka, you also managed to participate in the Mastermind quiz in 2000. You've participated in quizzes ever since. You've also nurtured a keen interest in history. And I was just saying earlier, you seem to know all of old Delhi's streets by heart. So, what would you say about the importance of nurturing a hobby or an interest besides the law for lawyers?
It's absolutely necessary because, and let me start on a sad story. The sad story was, no, it's, when I told you that my senior had a stroke and then in 99, he died. When I went to see him in the Apollo hospital, I got into a conversation with his son, and one of the things that the son analyzed was that he was so much of a lawyer that he probably had no sense of self-worth outside the profession, and therefore when he fell ill and could not come to court, probably that was what hastened his end. So there are going to be great periods in law when, for various reasons, you may not really be required to be in court, or there may not be work. There is also there will also be periods when what starts off as a hobby or a pastime becomes your primary vocation. So in my own case, you spoke about the Karnataka years; those were extremely busy. But when I stepped off in 2010, at that particular point of time, getting back as an AOR, getting back to be briefed by others as a junior counsel, that took time. And that was the time that somehow, because that my television appearances started. And it was probably because they found most of the television studios are in Noida, in Sector 16, and that's just a straight line from where I used to live in Mayur Vihar. And the studios just had to send a car and I'd be there as a guest. So there was something which was an alternative, which then began consuming a lot of time, but it then gave me a different perspective on how news was framed, how news fashioned the politics of the day. And again, it was my quizzing instincts which gave me an ability to put things in perspective. I could say, oh, look, something similar happened about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and this is what happened then. So that's how I kept getting called for further interactions. And at television, then having established myself there, then it got on to writing, and then writing columns and writing newspaper articles gave me a different perspective altogether. So that, and plus my very bad double tennis. These are two activities which are there to lend structure to a day, on a day that the courts do not necessarily require. So it is very important, if you are going to be a lawyer for the long term, to also have something else which gives you joy. It's said about Mr. Sirvai that he would work every day, but Saturdays was strictly reserved for family, for music, and for English literature. He also knew how to compartmentalize.
So, now, going back to your legal practice, 2010 you resigned as a standing counsel for Karnataka. In 2015, April 15 is when you were designated as a senior advocate. Now, is designation something that you work towards? And what are the changes that one needs to make to their practice if an AOR or someone else is looking at senior designation?
See, you have to work towards being designated. You have to let people know that you're interested in designation. In my own case, I had applied way back in 2008, and in 2008, on the first occasion itself, I was told by one of the judges that I had almost got designated, but for the fact that somebody said he's a bit young. Once that moment passed, then the moment did not come again from 2008 to 2015 is 7 years. It can be extremely frustrating. So if you ask me, do you have to work towards designation? Yes. If you ask me, what are the changes that come after designation? Well, the first change is that designation is basically like taking fresh guard at the crease. This is a different game. The judges may designate you. The bar has to separately designate you. This is what Uday Lalit, when he became a senior, said. And I think there's great wisdom in it, because many a person with a good practice as an advocate on record has failed to make the transition into being a briefed senior counsel after his designation. That's why you also had what were called courtesy designations, where an advocate on record who would put in many years of practice, who wanted to gently hang up his boots, he would apply for designation, he would be designated, and then fade out as a senior counsel. There are various kinds of advice on how you have to behave after you become a senior advocate. There are people who say that no, you must appear to be rich, you must appear to be exclusive. People must be made to feel that there is an aura. I really don't believe in all that. I think that your presence in court is what determines your ultimate success in the bar. It is not the length of your car, but the strength of your argument that finally tells the world whether you're a senior worth briefing or not.
I think that also is an explanation for the car that you've been driving. I have no idea for how many years. Now, coming to your practice after having been designated a senior, you've been a amicus curiae when the Nirbhaya appeals were before the Supreme Court. You've were also leading the arguments for the petitioners in the case where the Supreme Court laid down guidelines regarding lynching in the country. So is there a particular case which stands out amongst the cases that you've done in the last 5 years or even earlier?
Well, there have been all kinds of cases, and sometimes uh, those are your greatest satisfactions appear in sometimes cases where you don't where there is no reported judgment. Maybe one of the greatest satisfactions I had after I became a senior counsel was when you remember that case, Pranjal, where there was this girl who was a watchman's daughter who had got into a medical college, and then the high court then did not sustain her admission. Just before a vacation, we ran for a mentioning and got a interim protection from Justice Deepak Mishra. Somehow it survived, and her she went on to continue studying in that college. Then it came up before a bench which was not particularly known to be prone to helping petitioners. Yet we managed to keep that matter alive and survive till one day that very bench, which we thought was not very good for us, just said yes. Now you can't be moved. And so there is no judgment there. There is no judicial monument. But somewhere, someday, I think by now she must have. It's almost 5 years. I think she would probably be a doctor now and ready to help the world out. Somebody suffering from COVID or whatever. But for those few moments in court, he would have probably gone back to being a watchman's daughter. So those are cases that stick in your mind. But if you are looking at doctrine and all that, I think the Shraddhananda case, which I argued before I became a senior, and which actually gave me the confidence to apply for designation, was something that I will remember. Because if you remember, the Shraddhananda case was the first case where the Supreme Court finally laid down as a matter of law that it could come in the way of the government's powers to remit a life sentence. There was this question as to whether a life sentence meant only 14 years or it meant life for the rest of your life unless remitted. And whether the sentencing court could put a clog on the remission powers of the government and say, no, you will not remit this man's sentence unless he has served at least 20 years or at least 30 years or at least 50 years or something like that. And in Shraddhananda, the court said that as an alternative to the death sentence, where an ordinary life sentence of 14 years is simply not enough, the court can still put a clog on the government's power to remit. The interesting part of the Shraddhananda case, which took many days of argument, was that it first came up before a bench of 2 judges, which had never given a death sentence. And so it was there that I prepared for the alternative of saying, give him a life sentence for the rest of his life. Justice Sinha went for that option, but Justice Kadzu sentenced him to death, and that's how it came up before 3 judges. And then 3 judges said, oh, we've done all this before by mere orders, but what is the legal basis? And when they asked that question, that the entire doctrine was laid down. Uday Lalit, then as a senior advocate, had appeared for the deceased family. And here is something peculiar, that later on, when the same issue came up before him as a judge, in the Sriharan case, he said, no, the court cannot put a clog on redemption. But he was in the minority. The majority still upheld the Shraddhananda doctrine.
So, now, you've worn many hats. You are known to people as someone who appears on TV frequently. Your columns in papers are something people read. Your Hindu edits are extremely popular amongst UPSC aspirants, including my brother. Have you ever felt that these roles of being a part-time TV personality or a writer, has that ever gotten in the way of your primary job as a lawyer?
Uh, I don't think it has consciously come in the way of my primary job as a lawyer. If anything, it has helped me clarify my own thinking on legal issues. It has helped me put judgments in context for the reading public. It has sometimes put an issue in historical context for many people. Those pieces are not easy to write. They take most of a day or more sometimes, and there are many more pieces which are abandoned than which finally come to publication. So I don't think they have actively harmed me. But of course, we live in a very competitive environment. You can always trip somebody up professionally by praising him. You can say, "Oh yes, he's a very good lawyer, but he's a better writer." So damning with faint praise, you can always expect your friends all over to do it.
So, I will just conclude with a question because there are a large number of questions which the audience has sent us. Is there some advice, I wouldn't say one piece of advice, but is there some advice that 55-year-old Sanjay Hegde would give to 22-year-old Sanjay Hegde?
Oh, if I had to give myself advice, that is interesting, because you're actually asking whether I have any regrets about what I have done. I've always been a muffat. I wonder whether I would have gone further had I kept my mouth shut at times. But then I don't regret it. What you see with me is what you get. I rarely can see being discreet or acquiescing in something which is not correct to my point of view. To revert to what to my senior, he used to quote what his father would say. His father would once said that for ambition, look upwards. For content, look downwards. Look at the journey that you have come through so far. And if at the beginning of your journey, you were told that at this stage in life, you would be at somewhere here, would you think you had been a success or not? I don't think on that balance that I regret anything that I've said or anything that has held me back in terms of my frank attitude. But that's for me. Each person, each lawyer has to find his own comfort level. He has to find his or her own voice. Never try to copy anybody else. The market will come for a different voice as long as that voice is true to its own self. In other words, don't be a faku.
So I will end with my own questions here. There is a large volume of questions which has come, and there is one which I probably didn't want to ask given its sub judice. But a number of people want to know, you were very active on Twitter for almost 10 years, till about October last year when your account was suspended. And all you really had to do to get back was to take down those 2 posts which Twitter found objectionable. So yes. Why take the fight against Twitter? Why take the hard road? Why take it up to litigation rather than just take those posts down?
That's exactly what. Please tell me what was wrong in having an August Landmesser picture. Now, Twitter seems to think that that is a Nazi photograph. Of course, everybody who knows the photograph, who's seen it, knows it's an anti-Nazi photograph. Now, I do not think that that particular reason will stand up in court. And if somebody like me, who has access to courts, who has access to good lawyers like you and my friend Jaideep Gupta, if I do not stand up for freedom of speech on a public platform, this may be a private company, but it nevertheless is a public platform, and it makes its money from being an open public platform. So therefore, it has to adhere to certain minimal standards, and if it is available in this country, it has to adhere to judicial and constitutional norms on freedom of speech. So if not me, who else would take them on?
Right, sir. The next question I have is that there's a lot of general questions on litigation advice. So there's someone who wants to know, should a lawyer specialize in a particular field of law, or should they keep their practice area wide?
Actually, I don't think lawyers have a choice. Your briefs find you. Sometimes you do one case on one issue, and then more and more come to you in the same forum. And though you resent being typecast, you have your bills to pay, you have so many other things to, and it is often better to know more and more about less and less in an era of specialization. Then you know that if there is a particular area which is going to be there for the foreseeable future, and you are going to be part of it, and that is going to give you your bread and butter, I say please go for that niche. Do not turn away other work, but in looking for other work, do not lose that niche. Lots of people, while starting off in the profession, ask me for advice as to where to start and all that. And I have only one answer. Please go to whichever place or whichever court that gives you work, as much work as you can do in the early years, because that is what will make you, as a lawyer, going forward. And it will give you a great deal of, every case that you lose, but you learn something, it probably be earn you 10 more briefs of that kind.
So there are two more questions that I have. The first one is there's someone who wants to know what is the type of senior that one should join when he starts the profession, and what is the role of a senior in a junior's professional growth?
Isn't that a question for you?
So
it's actually a question that you're better designed to answer. But something that you said to me made a great deal of sense. Where I remember you telling me that your group of friends had this to say about litigation, that ultimately if you get a good senior, litigation is good. And then somebody said, it all depends on who his senior was. So there is a certain parampara or a tradition which comes through chambers, how each person was treated in his time as a junior. Very often he is likely to treat his juniors the same way. Seniors have a great deal to do with nurturing a courtroom lawyer. But it may be that you do not find the correct senior initially. So you have to go around a bit till you find someone at the right point of time who teaches you and who you feel comfortable with. There's no magic formula.
So the last question, I'll just have to word this carefully to avoid defamation proceedings against Abhay. And it's actually a question from him. You've been active on television shows, and over the last 6-8 months, maybe longer, we've seen the 9 p.m. slot, which is used for debates, which you've been on, being used to to put it euphemistically, for oblique purposes. We've had a TV anchor who's just been interrogated by the police for half the day. I personally believe that there are others who would face similar cases if the law is strictly enforced. So what are your views on this subject?
See, there is that classic passage of Oliver Wendell Holmes, which is the basis for almost all cases on freedom of speech, where Holmes says that the answer to a speech is another speech. And it is only there where there is a contention in the marketplace of ideas that good ideas prevail. But Holmes himself said that even the most expansive definition of freedom of speech does not mean freedom to shout fire in a crowded theater. Now, these anchors that you speak of not only shout fire, they actually want to incite and inflame. They tend to sell a message that a certain community or a certain type of people are not part of this great country of ours. That anything that otherizes them, which consolidates the rest of the people in favor of one particular side, one of the political divide, that is good. That TRP arises out of what I call hate porn. These people have nothing to do with news. They have also nothing to do with noise, but they have everything to do with the harvesting of hate. For hate speech, I do not think freedom of speech applies in its full sense. Hate speech is an exception. And the only way to stop hate speech is to penalize it, either in terms of money in civil law or in terms of the criminal law. I do not particularly shed tears for somebody being interrogated for 12 hours. When you consider how many houses have been burnt, how many people have lost their lives, and how many children have been orphaned, how many women have been widowed as a consequence of all that hate speech over the past few years. It is not good for us as a society, and the sooner that we get rid of it, the better.
Thank you so much, sir. So I think this is all for me. Thank you for giving us your time. Thank you to Abhay for actually organizing this whole series. I'll hand it back to you, Abhay. Thank you.
Thank you, Pranjal. Thank you, Sanjay sir. This chat would leave many of us inspired from leaving what one assumes would have been a cozy government job to join the tumultuous profession was certainly a brave move, and clearly it has worked out in the end. So thank you for taking us through your inspiring journey. I think Pranjal also did an excellent job in getting most of the juicy parts out of you. The last part is something that all of us would probably introspect on, about what we as lawyers and as intellectuals think about what is going on in this great country of ours. Let me thank all the attendees for taking out time and attending this chat with Mr. Hegde. Just to update you all, our next guest on the webinar series is Justice Madan Lokur, who is a retired judge of the Supreme Court of India. He will be speaking on e-courts and virtual advocacy, the way forward. Justice Lokur's webinar is to be conducted on the 3rd of May, which is a Sunday at 5 p.m. Our social media pages will have more details about this. So please follow us on Facebook. You can look for Debrief Conversations. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Please look for Debrief Legal there. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel and like all our videos. That helps us reach more people. Thank you for joining us today, and stay safe, all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Abhay. Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Pranjal.
Thank you, sir.